November 1941, George Washington University Hospital, Washington, D.C. A 23-year-old woman lies in a recovery bed. Hours earlier, she could walk, she could speak, she could dress herself, say her own name, recognize the faces of the people she had spent her entire life trying to please. Now she cannot do any of those things. Her father had authorized an experimental surgery on her brain, a procedure the American Medical Association had not endorsed because he believed it would make her calmer, more manageable, easier to fall back into the family. The procedure lasted less than an hour. Its consequences would last 63 years. The young woman's name was Rosemary Kennedy, and after that morning, no one outside her family would know she existed for decades. The Kennedys would go on to build the most celebrated political dynasty in the country: a president, two senators, an American myth called Camelot. They would be photographed at inaugurations and funerals, mourned on live television, and remembered as the family that embodied both American aspiration and American grief. But before any of that, behind the photograph, they had already lost a daughter, not to death, but to a decision made in secret by the one man who controlled everything. This is the story of Rosemary Kennedy, the sister who was loved, hidden, and erased. It spans 9 children, 4 decades, and the question of what a famous name costs the one person in the family who cannot carry it. But that satisfying image, the Kennedy daughter who was presented to royalty, who danced and kept her diary and tried to match the extraordinary family she had been born into, did not end in a ballroom or in a society column or in any of the photographs that survived. It ended in a hospital room in Washington and then in decades of silence. To understand how the most controlled family in America came to destroy one of its own, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to Camelot, not to the White House, not even to London. You have to go back to a house in Brookline, Massachusetts, where a little girl was born who did everything she could to keep up, in a family that had decided long before she arrived that keeping up was the only thing that mattered. The name Kennedy, by the middle of the 20th century, meant something very specific in American life. It meant wealth converted into public service, Irish Catholic ambition polished into establishment respectability, a photogenic family so large and so confident that they seemed to have been designed for magazine covers. Before John F. Kennedy entered the White House, before the assassination and the eternal flame and the word Camelot became permanently attached to a political dynasty, the Kennedys had already built something rare, a name that felt to the American public like royalty without a crown. They were glamorous, they were competitive, they were everywhere. And the version of the family that the country came to love was, in almost every detail, a curated performance, engineered by one man who believed the presentation was destiny and that no private truth should ever be allowed to damage a public name. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. was the architect of everything the family became. Born in 1888 in East Boston to a politically connected Irish Catholic family, Joe understood power as a system of levers long before he had children to raise. His father, Patrick Joseph Kennedy, had risen from the docks to become a ward boss and state senator, which meant Joe grew up not in poverty, but in the particular atmosphere of Irish Boston striving, close enough to the Protestant establishment to study its machinery, far enough outside it to know that entry would require either force or money or both. Joe chose money. He made his first significant move in banking, becoming one of the youngest bank presidents in Massachusetts. Then he moved through a series of ventures with the restless appetite of a man who treated wealth not as comfort but as fuel. Stock trading, shipbuilding, liquor distribution, and a stint in Hollywood film production that taught him more about image management than any business school ever could. Joe shorted the stock market before the crash of 1929 with the timing of a man who trusted his own instincts above everything else. He pivoted into real estate and liquor at precisely the right moments. By the mid-1930s, his fortune was estimated in the hundreds of millions in today's terms, and he had begun to do what all American fortunes eventually demand of the men who build them: convert the money into permanence. That meant a family, not just children, but a project. A dynasty assembled with the same discipline Joe brought to a stock trade. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy was the other half of that project. Born in 1890, the eldest daughter of John Francis Honey Fitzgerald, the mayor of Boston, a man whose name alone could fill a hall in Dorchester or Roxbury. Rose had grown up inside the Irish Catholic political machine. She was educated at convent schools in Boston and briefly in Europe, deeply devout, socially polished, and trained from girlhood to manage a household as both a domestic institution and a public performance. When she married Joe Kennedy in October of 1914, at a ceremony officiated by Cardinal William O'Connell, the union joined Boston's two most prominent Irish Catholic families, one with political capital, the other with financial capital, and created a partnership that would produce 9 children and a name that would outlast all of them. Rose ran the family's interior life with a precision that bordered on clinical. She kept index cards for each child, tracking medical visits, vaccinations, dental appointments, school performance, and religious milestones. She organized meals, lessons, outings, and correspondence. She dressed her children carefully and expected them to present well in every setting. She believed, as Joe did, that the Kennedy name was not merely a family identity, but a collective enterprise, and that every child was responsible for upholding it. Into this world, this exacting, ambitious, fiercely loving, fiercely controlled world, Rosemary Kennedy was born on September 13th, 1918, at the family home in Brookline, Massachusetts. She was the third child and the first daughter. From the beginning, something was different. Rosemary was slow to crawl, slow to walk, slow to speak. She struggled with tasks that her older brothers, Joe Jr. and Jack, had managed easily at the same ages. The precise medical cause was never definitively established, whether complications during birth, oxygen deprivation during a delayed delivery, or some other factor. An early 20th century diagnostic medicine offered the family very little clarity. What was consistent and unmistakable from early childhood was this: Rosemary had an intellectual disability that placed her permanently behind the developmental pace of her siblings. In the Kennedy household, where quickness was currency and performance was the measure of belonging, that gap would come to define her life, and eventually it would destroy it. There is something about Rosemary's childhood that is worth sitting with for a moment, because the tragedy of a story is not that she was neglected. It is in many ways the opposite. Rose Kennedy worked to keep Rosemary at home, to fold her into the family's daily rhythm, to resist the advice that families of their class and era routinely received, which was, bluntly, to institutionalize a child like Rosemary early and spare the rest of the household the strain. In the 1920s and 1930s, the stigma around intellectual disability was enormous. Families with money and reputation had every social incentive to place children like Rosemary in distant residential facilities, out of sight of neighbors and society columnists, and to explain the absence with a vague reference to a boarding school or a health concern. Rose refused, at least in those early years. She searched for schools that might work. She found tutors. She kept Rosemary in the family photographs, at the family dinner table, on the family sailing trips and beach holidays at Hyannis Port. At meals, someone would quietly cut Rosemary's meat for her before the plate reached her. It was a small accommodation, barely visible to a guest, and it told the entire story. She was loved, she was included, she was protected, and she was marked as different, all in the same gesture, all at the same table, all without anyone saying a word about it. You have to understand the world Rosemary was growing up in to understand the choices this family would later make. In the 1920s and 30s, the medical profession had almost nothing useful to offer parents of a child with intellectual disability. Diagnosis was crude. The language was worse. The clinical vocabulary of the era categorized people like Rosemary with terms that would be considered slurs today, and the professional advice given to families of means was almost always the same. Place the child in an institution, remove her from the household, and protect the family's reputation. The eugenics movement, still respectable in American universities and public policy, treated intellectual disability as a hereditary stain to be managed through segregation, sterilization, and silence. For a family like the Kennedys, Irish Catholic, climbing, desperate to prove they belonged in the highest circles of American life, a daughter with a visible disability was not just a personal heartbreak, it was a social vulnerability. That context does not excuse what was eventually done to Rosemary, but it explains the fear that made it possible. Rosemary herself was not a passive figure being moved through a family she did not understand. She was affectionate and warm. She cared about her appearance, polished nails, pretty dresses, the grooming rituals that mattered in a household full of attractive, carefully turned out women. She liked music and dancing. She craved compliments. And her younger sister Eunice would remember decades later that a kind word about Rosemary's smile could light up her entire day, could make her feel for a moment like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. In her diary as a teenager, Rosemary recorded the small events of a young social life with an enthusiasm that is almost painful to read in hindsight. A dance at school, a concert, a dress she wore, even a visit to the White House. The handwriting was sometimes labored. The entries were simple, but the emotional content was unmistakable. She wanted what her brothers and sisters wanted: to be seen, to be admired, to belong to the world her family was building. The difference was that for Rosemary, belonging required constant effort, constant supervision, and a kind of performance that the rest of the Kennedys accomplished so easily it looked like breathing. Her siblings tried to include her. Eunice, who was 5 years younger, became Rosemary's closest companion in childhood. They swam together, played sports together, moved through the physical world of the Kennedy household as a pair. The family culture was competitive in everything: sailing, touch football, dinner table debates, academic performance. And Rosemary participated in what she could, was gently steered away from what she could not, and watched from a particular kind of distance the rest of the time. Her brother Jack, the second son, was sickly, bookish, and sharp witted, and he would grow into the public figure around whom the entire family mythology would eventually be constructed. Her sister Kathleen, kick to everyone, that was the social prodigy, the one who could walk into any room and own it within minutes, who collected friends and admirers the way other children collected stamps. Each Kennedy child was being shaped, consciously and unconsciously, into a representative of the family name. Rosemary was shaped too. She was taught how to dress, how to greet, how to behave at social functions. But the lesson the family could not teach her, because it was not a lesson at all, was how to be effortless in a family that demanded effortlessness above everything. And beneath the love and the careful accommodations, a colder logic operated. Joe Kennedy did not merely want his children to be happy. He wanted them to be impressive. He wanted them to embody a specific vision of American success: athletic, articulate, poised, photogenic, destined for public life. Each child was a representative of the Kennedy brand, and the brand was Joe's masterwork. Rosemary's limitations were not just emotionally difficult for him, they were structurally intolerable. A daughter who could not keep pace, who might say the wrong thing at a dinner, who might embarrass the family in the social and political world Joe was climbing through. That was not a private sadness in Joe Kennedy's architecture. It was a flaw in the design. And Joe Kennedy, by temperament and by decades of practice, fixed flaws. He did not endure them. That tension between the family's genuine love for Rosemary and its inability to tolerate her difference forever was held in check through the 1930s by a combination of careful management and a change of scenery that for a brief and fragile period seemed to solve everything. In late 1937, President Franklin Roosevelt appointed Joseph Kennedy as the United States ambassador to the Court of St. James's, the American ambassador to Great Britain. It was one of the most prestigious diplomatic posts in the world, a prize Joe had pursued with the same aggressive focus he brought to everything, and it moved the entire Kennedy family to London at exactly the moment the world was paying attention. The Kennedys arrived in England like visiting American royalty: 9 children ranging from toddler to young adult, a glamorous mother, a father who craved the spotlight, and a household staff to match the embassy's grandeur. They took up residence at the ambassador's quarters and swept through London society with a confidence that charmed the British press. The family was photographed constantly, at embassy receptions, at country houses, on holiday in France and Ireland, at sporting events, at church. They were big, beautiful, Catholic, American, and irresistible to the cameras. The image Joe had spent 20 years constructing was finally on the international stage. And the children, all 9 of them, were performing their roles. Joe Jr., the eldest, was being groomed as the political heir. Jack was at Harvard, reading and arguing and refining the wit that would eventually charm a nation. Kik was conquering London society with the ease of someone born to it. Bobby, Teddy, Jean, Pat, and Eunice were at various stages of childhood and adolescence, moving through the embassy world with the Kennedy confidence that was, by this point, as natural to them as breathing. Even in London, even at their most dazzling, the family was a system. And inside that system, everyone had a function, except Rosemary, whose function was to not be noticed. For Rosemary, the London years were both the best period of her life and the most quietly dangerous. In England, she was placed in a Montessori-style program at a convent school in Hertfordshire, a setting run by nuns who understood patience, routine, and calibrated expectation. For the first time, Rosemary found an environment that matched her capacities rather than punishing her for what she could not do. The structure was gentle, the pace was humane. The nuns offered encouragement rather than competition, concrete tasks rather than open-ended challenges, praise for steady effort rather than only for achievement. Rosemary was happier in England than she had been anywhere before, and that fact carries a particular kind of weight in this story, because the one place where she truly flourished was temporary, fragile, and about to be taken from her by forces no one in the family controlled. The family's public apex came in May of 1938, when Rosemary and Kathleen were presented at the court of St. James's, before King George II and Queen Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace. The presentation at court was an old-world ritual of social arrival, a ceremony that announced to the highest tier of British society that these young women were worth receiving. Rose Kennedy, radiant in her white gown, watched as two of her daughters performed a deep curtsy before the British sovereigns in the palace's throne room. Kathleen was everything the occasion was designed for: charming, effortless, luminous, already beginning to become one of the most popular young women in London's aristocratic circles. She would go on to fall in love with the British Marquis's son, to marry into English nobility over her mother's anguished objections, and to claim a life in England that was entirely her own. And beside her that evening stood Rosemary, in her own white gown, performing the same curtsy, wearing the same smile, inhabiting for one evening the full glory of the family's public image. That image is devastating in retrospect. The daughter who would spend most of her adult life hidden from the world was, on a spring evening in London, literally being presented before a king and queen. The photograph from that night survived. The life it seemed to promise did not. But even in the golden setting of London, maternal worry was hardening into something less patient than care. Rose feared not only that Rosemary might become confused or lost in the city, but that adult vulnerability in a capital like London could expose her to dangers the family could not monitor or contain. The supervision that had felt merely careful in Brookline began to feel urgent in a diplomatic capital full of strangers, parties, and young men. Rosemary was no longer a child. She was a young woman in a city built for socializing, and the same qualities that made her eager and affectionate, her desire for connection, her longing for inclusion, her warmth, were now being reclassified inside the family's private conversations as risks. And then history intervened. By the autumn of 1939, war had engulfed Europe, and the Kennedy family's London life was over. Joe Kennedy's ambassadorship collapsed under the weight of his political misjudgments. His sympathy for appeasement, his pessimism about Britain's chances against Germany, his increasingly isolated position within the Roosevelt administration. The family returned to the United States in stages through 1940, and with that return, the best environment Rosemary Kennedy had ever known disappeared across an ocean and into a world war. For every other Kennedy, the move home was a pivot. Joe refocused on domestic politics and on positioning his sons for public careers. Kik eventually returned to England on her own terms, drawn by the love affair that would define and shorten her life. Jack moved toward the military service that would make him a war hero and eventually a congressman. The family machine kept running, kept building, kept climbing toward the future Joe had always envisioned. For Rosemary, the return was a catastrophe. The Montessori convent was gone. The patient nuns were gone. The routine, the calm, the structured days where she had been happiest and steadiest were now unreachable. Back in the United States, Rosemary was placed in a series of schools and supervised residential settings. A convent in Washington, D.C., then other arrangements, each one an attempt to replicate an environment that could not be replicated because it had not been the institution that made Rosemary stable. It had been the fit between Rosemary and a particular kind of care: patient, structured, uncompetitive, steady. And that fit had been achieved once, accidentally, in a convent in the English countryside. Nothing in America matched it. She was 21 years old, then 22, and she was a grown woman living inside a family that still treated her primarily as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be understood. Rose Kennedy, to her credit, kept searching. She visited schools, she consulted doctors, she worried about Rosemary's safety, about her happiness, about the narrowing set of options available. But Rose's worry existed inside the same framework that created the problem. A world where appearance mattered as much as feeling, where Catholic endurance was a higher value than honest reckoning, and where the answer to difficulty was always management, never surrender. Rose did not want to give up on Rosemary, but she also could not imagine a version of the family where Rosemary's difference was simply accepted, publicly, without apology or concealment. That gap, some between Rose's love and Rose's limits, is one of the most painful dimensions of this story. Eunice, still a teenager, watched her older sister struggle and stored what she saw. Years later, she would describe this period as the time Rosemary seemed to be slipping backward, losing ground that the London years had so carefully built. Eunice did not have the power to change anything in 1940 or 1941. She was a younger sister in a patriarchal household where the father made the decisions. But she was paying attention, and what she witnessed during these months would eventually fuel a lifetime of advocacy that changed disability policy in America. That is a later chapter. For now, Eunice was simply watching a sister she loved become someone she no longer fully recognized. Rosemary wanted things that young women her age wanted: to go out, to have a social life, to dress up and be noticed, to feel some version of the independence her siblings were already living. And the more she pushed against the boundaries the family drew around her, the more frightened the Kennedys became. What shifted between 1940 and 1941 was not Rosemary's disability. What shifted was the collision between her growing adulthood and the family's compulsive need for control. She began to have mood swings, periods of frustration and agitation that the adults around her found alarming. She grew more assertive, more restless, more resistant to supervision. She sneaked out at night. For a family whose entire identity rested on discipline, image, and presentation, and whose patriarch was at that very moment engineering his eldest son's entry into political life, Rosemary's increasing unpredictability was more than a parenting difficulty. It was a threat to the project itself. The family's private vocabulary shifted. The conversations were no longer about which school might help her or which tutor might reach her. They were about containment, about risk, about what Rosemary might do if she could not be controlled, to herself, to her reputation, and to the family's name. You have to understand what that meant inside this particular family. Joe Kennedy had spent his entire adult life believing that problems yield to money, will, and the right people in the right positions. He had bought his way into Hollywood. He had finessed his way into the ambassadorship. He was now positioning Jack Kennedy for the congressional run that would begin the political dynasty he had always wanted. Joe did not accept situations that could not be managed. He did not sit with uncertainty. He did not wait for problems to resolve themselves. He acted. And sometime in the autumn of 1941, someone told him about a new medical procedure, experimental, aggressive, championed by a small circle of physicians who believed they had found a way to calm patients suffering from agitation, mood instability, and behavioral difficulties. The procedure involved inserting instruments through small openings in the skull and severing connections in the brain's prefrontal lobe. Its leading American advocates, Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James Watts, had been performing it since the mid-1930s and spoke about it with the certainty of men who believed they had discovered something the rest of the medical establishment simply had not caught up to yet. The procedure was called a prefrontal lobotomy. The American Medical Association had not endorsed it. Peer-reviewed data on long-term outcomes was almost non-existent. The failure rate The rate at which patients emerged not calmed but catastrophically diminished was not a number these physicians volunteered. The era handed families like the Kennedys a choice between imperfect options and a procedure that sounded, to a man like Joe, like decisive action. The era did not hand them the ethical guardrails that might have stopped what happened next. Joseph Kennedy listened. He consulted. He made his decision the way he had always made decisions, privately, with authority, and without waiting for consensus. And he authorized what would come next. What he did not know, what no one in that family could yet see, was that the procedure he had just approved would not solve the problem of Rosemary Kennedy. It would erase her. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There is so much more to this family that the public never saw. And we're just getting started. The months between the family's return to America and that autumn decision in 1941 were not a single crisis. They were a slow constriction, a period measured not in dramatic confrontation, but in phone calls, consultations, quiet conversations between adults who believed they were being responsible, and a young woman who could feel the walls closing around her without being able to name what was happening or stop it. It started with placement. After England, the family cycled Rosemary through supervised settings in the Washington, D.C. area, trying to find an arrangement that could manage her without drawing attention. A convent school, another residential program. Each transition meant new faces, new routines, new rooms to learn, new people who did not know Rosemary and who had been told about her limitations before they had ever been told about her warmth, her humor, or the way she came alive when someone treated her like she belonged. Each placement was an attempt to reconstruct, in American soil, the stability that the English convent had provided almost by accident, through patience, through calibrated expectation, through the particular grace of nuns who had seen in Rosemary a person worth meeting on her own terms, rather than a problem to be solved on someone else's. Each placement fell short, or worked for a time before the old frustrations resurfaced. Rosemary was not getting worse in any medical sense. She was getting older. She was 21, then 22, then 23. And the distance between what she wanted from her life and what the family was willing to allow her to have was widening with every month that passed. The schools reported difficulty. The supervisors reported incidents. The language of the reports, agitation, mood instability, noncompliance, told a story that institutions always tell about the people they cannot accommodate. The problem was the person, not the system. The consultations are worth pausing on because they revealed a particular way a powerful family converts private distress into administrative action. Joe and Rose Kennedy were not sitting helplessly in Hyannisport waiting for a crisis to resolve itself. They were mobilizing, the same way Joe mobilized when a business deal went sideways or a political relationship needed repair. Doctors were consulted, schools were evaluated, letters were exchanged between physicians, headmistresses, and family representatives. The language in these conversations was practical and managerial. Supervision levels, behavioral reports, risk assessments, institutional capacity. It was the vocabulary of care, stripped of its emotional content. The language of people who had decided that the way to help Rosemary was to find the right container for her, not to ask whether containment was the right approach in the first place. The mundane, bureaucratic quality of this process is part of what makes it so difficult to sit with. A life was being decided in conference rooms and over telephone lines through professional assessments and expert opinions by adults who believed they were acting in Rosemary's best interest and who never once asked her what she wanted. Her future was being reclassified from education to management, from management to containment, from containment to something that no one had yet named, but that Joe Kennedy was already beginning to consider. A life was being dismantled through paperwork and authority, not through the kind of cruelty most people imagine when they hear the word, not through violence or indifference, but through the particular kind of cruelty that looks from the outside like responsible decision-making by people who had access to every resource in the world except the willingness to accept their daughter as she was. Rose Kennedy, during this period, was doing what she had always done, the searching, managing, enduring. She visited schools. She asked questions. She corresponded with educators and medical professionals. She prayed. Rose's devotion to Rosemary was real. It had always been real. From the cut meat at the dinner table to the tutors she hired, from the family photographs she insisted Rosemary be included in, to the careful social coaching she provided before every public appearance. But Rose's capacity for advocacy had a ceiling, and that ceiling was Joe. In the Kennedy household, the mother managed the daily texture of the children's lives, the index cards, the schedules, the moral instruction, the dental appointments. The father made the structural decisions, the schools, the money, the placements, the strategy. That division had governed the marriage from the beginning, and Rose had accepted it the way she accepted most of the terms of her life with Joe. With discipline, with faith, with the particular Catholic stoicism that treats endurance as a virtue and open dissent as a failing. Whether Rose knew the full scope of what Joe was considering in the autumn of 1941, whether she was consulted about the lobotomy specifically, or informed only afterward, or told in terms that obscured what the procedure actually involved, is a question the public historical record does not resolve with the same certainty as the surgery itself. What is clear is that the decision belonged to Joe. He authorized it. He believed it would work, and he would carry what it did for the rest of his life. Eunice Kennedy, still a teenager during these months, watched her oldest sister struggle and stored what she saw. She would later describe this period as the time when Rosemary seemed to be slipping backward, losing the ground that the London years had so carefully built, becoming less like the sister Eunice had swum with and played alongside, and more like someone trapped inside a frustration she could feel but could not articulate. Eunice did not have the power to change anything in 1940 or 1941. She was a younger sister in a patriarchal household where the father's word was final. But she was paying attention with the kind of intensity that does not fade. What Eunice witnessed during these months, the consultations, the placements, the slow erasure of Rosemary's agency, would eventually fuel a lifetime of advocacy that changed the way America understood intellectual disability. That reckoning belongs to a later chapter. For now, Eunice was simply watching a sister she loved disappear into a system that could not see her. Joe Kennedy's logic by this point had narrowed to a corridor with only one exit. He had tried schools. He had tried supervision. He had tried the English convent, and that world was gone. Rosemary was sneaking out at night. She was having episodes of agitation that the people around her found unmanageable. She was a grown woman who could not be locked in a room, and the more she tried to live like one who was free, the more visible the gap between her and the rest of the family became. Joe was not a man who tolerated unsolvable problems. He was a man who had spent 40 years solving problems that other people declared impossible, and always by acting decisively, often by acting alone, and never by waiting for the situation to improve on its own. That psychology, applied to a stock trade or a political campaign, had made him one of the richest and most influential men in America. Applied to his daughter, it would become the most destructive decision of his life. There is something else operating in this story that it cannot honestly avoid. Joe Kennedy, in the autumn of 1941, was not only a father worried about a difficult daughter. He was a patriarch constructing a political dynasty whose timeline had already been set. Joe Jr., the eldest son, was being groomed for public office. The congressional seat, the governorship, eventually the presidency that Joe Sr. had once wanted for himself and had transferred with all the force of his ambition onto his firstborn boy. Jack was approaching the military service and the political career that would follow it. Bobby was still young, but already absorbing the family's culture of competition and public purpose. The Kennedy name was becoming a brand that would soon be tested in elections, in press scrutiny, in the kind of public examination that rewarded Polish and punished weakness. A daughter with an intellectual disability who could not be controlled, who might wander away from a supervised setting, who might be seen in circumstances that raise questions, who might become a newspaper item that an opponent could use, was not just a private concern in that context. It was a liability that could damage everything the family had spent decades building. Whether Joe articulated that calculation explicitly, or whether the political dimension was something he felt in his bones without putting words to it, the timing of his decision is impossible to separate from his ambition. The family was preparing to enter American political life at the highest level, and Rosemary, by the logic of the machine her father had built, needed to be resolved before that entry began. Rosemary herself, during these months, was living the other side of that equation, and the cruelest part of the story is that she did not know it. She was not a file on her father's desk. She was a 23-year-old woman who wanted to go to dances, who cared about how her hair looked, who liked being told she was pretty, who wanted to walk through a neighborhood without a chaperone deciding where she could go and when she had to return. The things Rosemary wanted were not extraordinary. They were the ordinary desires of a young woman trying to inhabit her own life. But inside the Kennedy system, those ordinary desires had become evidence. Her wish for independence was reclassified as instability. Her frustration at being controlled was interpreted as aggression. Her attempts to live a normal life became, in the family's private logic, proof that she was incapable of living one. The very qualities that made Rosemary human, her longing, her effort, her refusal to stop wanting, were what sealed her fate. And then a physician told Joseph Kennedy that the problem had a surgical solution. The procedure had been adapted for American patients by Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James Watts at George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C. It was based on the work of the Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Muniz, who had developed the leucotomy in the mid-1930s and who would, in 1949, receive a Nobel Prize for the work, a fact that speaks less to the procedure's merit than to the era's willingness to reward medical confidence over long-term evidence. Freeman, in particular, was an evangelist for the lobotomy. He was a man who believed he had found a technique that could transform the treatment of psychiatric and behavioral conditions, and he promoted it with the certainty and the showmanship of someone who saw himself not as a cautious scientist, but as a pioneer. He gave lectures, he spoke to the press, he cultivated the kind of reputation that reassured desperate families and alarmed a significant portion of his medical colleagues. The American Medical Association had not endorsed the procedure. Many psychiatrists considered it reckless, a blunt, irreversible intervention performed on patients who could not fully consent to it and justified by a theoretical model of brain function that was at best incomplete. But Freeman and Watts had accumulated enough case studies to build a persuasive narrative of success, and they had the confidence of men who believed the rest of the medical world would eventually catch up to what they already understood. Joe Kennedy was exactly the kind of father that Freeman's certainty was designed to reach. Wealthy, decisive, accustomed to expert counsel, impatient with ambiguity, and motivated by a problem he needed solved permanently. The consultation would have been framed in the language of modern medicine and measured optimism. A procedure, a recovery period, a calmer and more manageable daughter on the other side. What it would not have included, because the data did not exist in any honest form, was a frank accounting of the failures. The patients who emerged not calmed but hollowed out, not stabilized but permanently diminished, stripped of the very capacities, personality, language, initiative, warmth, that made them recognizable to the people who loved them. The era handed families like the Kennedys a terrible bargain, imperfect options on one side and a procedure that sounded like decisive action on the other. The era did not provide the ethical guardrails that might have stopped what happened next. Joe authorized the lobotomy. He did not convene a family discussion. He did not ask Rosemary what she wanted. He made the decision the way he had always made decisions. As the patriarch, with the authority he had always claimed and the family had always granted him. And he set the date. In November of 1941, Rosemary Kennedy was brought to George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C. She was 23 years old. Outside the hospital, the country was weeks away from Pearl Harbor and the war that would consume the world her brothers were about to enter. Inside, the corridors had the institutional quiet of a place where consequential things happened behind closed doors and were spoken about afterward in careful language. Rosemary had spent the previous years struggling against the boundaries her family had drawn around her life, wanting more freedom, more presence in the world, more of the ordinary adulthood she could see her siblings inhabiting so effortlessly. She had been presented at Buckingham Palace 3 years earlier, wearing white and curtsying before a king. She had written diary entries about concerts and dances in handwriting that cost her more effort than her brothers spent on an entire term papers. She had smiled when someone praised her appearance, And that smile had been, by every family account, something radiant and real and entirely her own. She had been loved, supervised, accommodated, managed, relocated, assessed, and classified for her entire conscious life. She had never been asked by anyone with the authority to change her circumstances what kind of life she actually wanted to live. No one had asked her about this either. No one had explained to her what was about to happen, or why, or what the risks were, or what she might lose. Now she was in a hospital room in Washington, and two doctors were preparing to cut into her brain. The procedure was performed by Freeman and Watts. The standard technique involved making small burr holes in the skull and inserting a surgical instrument to sever connection in the prefrontal lobe, the region of the brain associated with personality, judgment, emotional regulation, and initiative. Later accounts that have entered the public record of this case describe the doctors monitoring Rosemary's responses during the operation, asking her to recite, to sing, to count, using her diminishing verbal ability as a gauge for how deep to cut. Whether that specific clinical detail rests on the strongest primary documentation or on later retellings that have calcified into accepted narrative is a question the historical record does not fully settle. What no source disputes, what is not ambiguous, not contested, not subject to interpretation, is the outcome. The surgery failed. It failed immediately, it failed catastrophically, and it failed permanently. When the procedure was finished, Rosemary Kennedy could no longer walk without assistance. She could no longer speak in coherent sentences. She could no longer dress herself, feed herself, or perform any of the tasks of daily life that she had managed, with effort and with help, for 23 years. The young woman who had curtsied before the King and Queen of England, who had recorded dances and concerts in her diary with careful excitement, who had sneaked out at night because she wanted to live the same life her sisters lived, who had lit up when someone told her she looked beautiful. That woman was gone, not dead, not absent in a way that could be mourned with the rituals the Kennedys would later master, gone in a way that was worse than death for the people who had known her, because the body remained and the person inside it did not. The lobotomy had not calmed Rosemary Kennedy. It had not made her easier to manage. It had destroyed the part of her that was Rosemary. The personality, the warmth, the effort, the longing, the stubborn human insistence on being treated as a person who mattered. All of it had been severed along with the neural connections in her prefrontal cortex. She was alive, and she would remain alive for more than 60 years. 6 decades in which the Kennedy name would become the most famous in American politics, in which her brothers would be elected and assassinated and mourned on television, in which her family's public grief would become a kind of national ritual. But the life Rosemary had been trying to build, the life she had been reaching for with everything she had, was over. The aftermath was not a public reckoning. It was not a press conference or a hospital disclosure or a family gathering where the weight of what had happened was shared and borne collectively. There was no accountability because accountability requires transparency, and the Kennedys had already decided that transparency was not an option. The aftermath was silence, total, deliberate, and sustained across decades. Rosemary was removed from the family's visible world. She was placed in institutional care almost immediately, transferred eventually to St. Coletta, a Catholic residential community in Jefferson, Wisconsin, a small town far from the Kennedy homes in Massachusetts and Florida, far from the political stages her brothers were preparing to walk onto, far from any camera or reporter or society columnist who might ask him where the eldest Kennedy daughter had gone. St. Coletta was run by the Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi, and it provided residential care for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It was, by the standards of the era, a humane facility, but it was also, for the family's purposes, invisible. Rosemary would live there for decades, cared for by nuns and staff, visited infrequently in the early years, and spoken of publicly almost never. The concealment was total. When the subject of Rosemary arose at all in the years that followed, and it arose rarely, because the family had become expert at controlling its own narrative, the explanation offered was deliberately misleading. A daughter who preferred a private life, a young woman who was teaching or working with children somewhere in the Midwest, a sister who did not share the family's appetite for public attention. These vague deflections were accepted because no one had reason to challenge them, and because the Kennedy publicity machine, which could generate favorable coverage as reliably as a factory, was equally skilled at ensuring that certain stories were never told. The truth that Joseph Kennedy had authorized an experimental brain surgery that had left his eldest daughter permanently and profoundly incapacitated, and that the family had then concealed her existence from the American public, was buried so deeply that it would not surface publicly for more than 20 years. Joe Kennedy, in the weeks and months that followed, became a man carrying a weight that no amount of money or influence could lift. He had wanted to fix the problem. He had fixed nothing. He had erased his daughter, not from the earth, but from the life she had been trying to live on it. The patriarch who believed he could control everything had made the one decision that could never be reversed. And the result was not order, but annihilation. Whether guilt consumed him or whether he buried that too beneath the relentless forward momentum of the family project is something only Joe knew. What is visible from the outside is that he never spoke publicly about what he had done, and that the secret sat at the center of the Kennedy story like a sealed room, present, shaping everything around it, and never open. Rose Kennedy entered a new permanent reality. Her daughter was alive but unreachable, housed in a residential facility in rural Wisconsin, no longer the young woman who had tried on dresses and written about dances. Rose would later indicate that she had not been told about the lobotomy in advance, a claim that biographers have examined without reaching a definitive conclusion. What is beyond dispute is that Rose, whether she knew beforehand or learned after, now had to absorb a loss that had no public language and no cultural script. There was no death to mourn. There was no funeral mass to attend. There was only an absence that could not be explained honestly, and a daughter who was, in the family's operational terms, no longer part of the story. The siblings experienced Rosemary's disappearance the way children in powerful families experience the things that are never explained to them. Through silence, through a sudden absence where a presence had been, through the unspoken understanding that certain questions were not welcome. Rosemary stopped appearing at holidays. She stopped appearing in photographs. She stopped being mentioned in the family's public narrative. For Eunice, who had been closer to Rosemary than anyone, the loss was a wound that would take 2 decades to convert into something the world could see. For Jack, moving toward the war and the political life that would define him, Rosemary's absence became part of the background architecture of a family that had learned, long before it learned to grieve publicly, how to make someone disappear. The family that would become synonymous with American tragedy, with assassinations broadcast into living rooms, with funerals watched by hundreds of millions, with grief performed in black veils before the cameras of the entire world, began its long acquaintance with irreversible loss, not in public view, but in the most private act of erasure imaginable. Before Camelot, before Dallas, before the Ambassador Hotel, before Chappaquiddick, before any of the catastrophes that would make the Kennedy name a synonym for national heartbreak, there was this: a father who believed he could fix his daughter, a surgery that destroyed her instead, and a silence so complete that America did not learn what had happened to Rosemary Kennedy for more than 20 years. She was 23 years old. She was in a room in Wisconsin. And the family went on building the dynasty without her. The world moved on. The Kennedys moved on. Rosemary did not. At St. Coletta in Jefferson, Wisconsin, the days took on the rhythm that institutional life imposes on the people who live inside it. Meals at set times, therapy sessions, supervised walks, the slow rotation of seasons in a small town, in the rural Midwest, where nobody outside the facility had any reason to know that one of the residents was the daughter of the most ambitious political family in America. Rosemary arrived at St. Coletta in the late 1940s after an initial period of care elsewhere, and the community that received her was run by the Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi, Catholic women who had devoted their lives to caring for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They provided what the Kennedy household, for all its wealth and all its love, had never been able to provide: a life built around Rosemary's actual capacities rather than around the family's need for her to be someone she was not. But it was a life constructed after the damage had been done. The Rosemary who arrived at St. Coletta was not the young woman who had danced and kept a diary and polished her nails. She was someone who needed help walking, who could speak only with great difficulty, who required assistance with the most basic tasks of daily living. The lobotomy had not merely altered her, it had reduced her to a version of herself that bore almost no resemblance to the person her family had known. In the early years, the family's contact with Rosemary was limited, in some accounts nearly non-existent. Joe Kennedy, the man who had authorized the surgery, did not visit. Rose did not visit for a long time. The reasons were never publicly explained by the family, and the silence speaks in a register that does not require translation. Whether it was guilt or shame, or the same instinct for concealment that had governed the family's handling of Rosemary from the beginning, or simply the inability to face what had been done. To sit in a room with the living evidence of a decision that could not be undone. The result was the same. The daughter who had been erased from public life was also, for years, largely erased from the family's private life. Rosemary lived at St. Coletta with the nuns and the other residents, receiving care, undergoing physical therapy, relearning some basic functions with agonizing slowness. She was not abandoned in the way that word is usually meant. The family paid for her care, ensured the facility was funded, maintained the institutional relationship. But she was alone in the way that matters most. The people she had spent her life trying to keep up with were not there. Meanwhile, outside that facility in Wisconsin, the Kennedy family was building the most celebrated political dynasty in American history, and the speed of their ascent only deepened the cruelty of the contrast. In 1943, Joe Kennedy Jr., the eldest son, the one who had been groomed since birth to carry the family's political ambitions, was killed in a bombing mission over the English Channel. He was 29 years old. The family's first public tragedy arrived not with Rosemary's lobotomy, which the country did not know about, but with Joe Jr.'s death, which the country mourned alongside them. In 1944, Kathleen, Kick, the dazzling sister who had been presented at court alongside Rosemary, married an English aristocrat against her family's wishes and then lost him to the war within months. 4 years later, in 1948, Kick herself was killed in a plane crash in France. She was 28. The Kennedy family that the public saw was already becoming acquainted with the particular kind of loss that would define its mythology. Sudden, violent, public, and born with the stoic composure that Americans found both admirable and heartbreaking. But there was a loss the public did not see, and it had come first. Jack Kennedy ran for Congress in 1946 and won. He ran for the Senate in 1952 and won. He married Jacqueline Bouvier in 1953, and the wedding at St. Mary's Church in Newport, Rhode Island, became one of the most photographed social events of the decade. 1,200 guests, a reception at Hammersmith Farm, a young senator and his elegant bride stepping onto the national stage with the kind of ease that seemed to the millions reading about it in the morning papers, like destiny made visible. When Jack Kennedy ran for president in 1960 and won, the family completed the transformation that Joe Sr. had been engineering for 40 years, the conversion of Irish Catholic wealth into American political royalty. The word Camelot entered the political vocabulary. The Kennedys were on the covers of every magazine in the country. They were young, beautiful, vigorous, and symbolic, a family that seemed to embody the best version of what America wanted to believe about itself. And through all of it, through every campaign photograph, every inaugural ball, every touch football game at Hyannisport, every magazine profile that celebrated the family's vitality and charm, Rosemary Kennedy was in a room in Wisconsin, being cared for by nuns, absent from every image the country associated with her family's name. When Jackie Kennedy redecorated the White House, Rosemary was not there. When the family gathered at the compound for holidays that were themselves performances of unity and vigor, Rosemary was not there. When the cameras captured the Kennedy children playing on the White House lawn, no one in the press asked where the eldest Kennedy daughter had gone, because the family had ensured through decades of careful narrative management that no one thought to ask. That absence is not a footnote. It is the foundation the mythology was built on. The family that America fell in love with was a family with a secret at its center, and the secret was not a scandal or a financial impropriety or a political betrayal. It was a daughter, a sister, a woman who had been alive the entire time, living out the consequences of a decision that had been made for her by a father who believed he was protecting the family's future and who had instead created its deepest and most enduring wound. On November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. He was 46 years old. The nation mourned in a way it had never mourned before. The funeral procession, the riderless horse, Jackie Kennedy's black veil, John Jr.'s salute, the images burned into the American consciousness for generations. The Kennedys became, in that moment, not just a political family, but a symbol of national grief. Less than 5 years later, on June 5th, 1968, Robert F. Kennedy was shot at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles after winning the California Democratic primary. He died the following day. He was 42. The family that had already been defined by public tragedy was now being consumed by it. Assassination after assassination, grief piled on grief. The camera is always present, the nation always watching. And through all of it, Rosemary was in Wisconsin. She did not attend Jack's funeral. She did not attend Bobby's. She was not part of the public mourning that made the Kennedy name synonymous with American heartbreak, because she had been removed from the family's public story 2 decades before the first bullet was fired. The tragedies that the country saw, the ones it photographed, televised, and wept over, came after the tragedy it did not see. The Kennedys' long education and loss had begun. Not in Dallas in 1963, but in a hospital in Washington in 1941, with a daughter who did not die, but who was taken from the family's life as thoroughly as if she had. The first crack in the silence came not from the press or from a political opponent, but from inside the family itself. In 1962, Eunice Kennedy Shriver published an article in the Saturday Evening Post that for the first time publicly acknowledged that the Kennedy family included a member with intellectual disability. Eunice did not reveal the lobotomy. The truth would remain buried for years longer. But she wrote about Rosemary with a candor that was, for the era and for a family as controlled as the Kennedys, extraordinary. She described a sister who had been slower than the other children, who had struggled in school, who had been loving and eager to please, and who had eventually been placed in institutional care. The article was careful, it was measured, it did not use the word lobotomy, but it did something that no Kennedy had done before. It admitted in print that the family's private reality was different from its public image, and it used that admission as a launching pad for something much larger. Eunice had been preparing for this moment for years, perhaps in some sense, for her entire adult life. What she had witnessed as a teenager, Rosemary's struggle, the family's consultations, the slow narrowing of her sister's world, had not faded with time. It had clarified. Eunice had watched the old system fail Rosemary, and she had decided with the same fierce determination that characterized every Kennedy enterprise that the system itself had to change. As early as 1946, the family had established the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation, named after the eldest brother killed in the war, and Eunice had become a driving force within it. Under her leadership, the foundation directed its resources toward research into the causes of intellectual disability, toward improving the quality of institutional care, toward funding programs that treated people with disabilities as people rather than as problems to be hidden. The connection between Rosemary's private suffering and Eunice's public mission was direct, even if it would take years for the full scope of that connection to become visible. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy, Rosemary's brother, the man whose political career had been built in part on the image of a perfect family, established the President's Panel on Mental Retardation, making intellectual disability a federal policy priority for the first time in American history. 2 years later, in October of 1963, just weeks before his assassination, Jack Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act, which began the long process of shifting care for people with mental illness and intellectual disabilities away from large, isolated institutions and toward community-based treatment. The legislation was imperfect. Its implementation would be uneven and underfunded for decades. But its existence, the fact that a sitting president had made this cause a priority, was inseparable from the Kennedy family story. Jack Kennedy knew what had happened to his sister. He understood in a way the American public did not the human cost of a society that stigmatized disability and offered families nothing better than concealment or experimental surgery. Whether his motivation was personal guilt, political strategy, Genuine compassion, or some combination that he himself could not have untangled, is a question that resists simple answers. It was probably all of them at once. What mattered was that the machinery of government was, for the first time, being directed toward the problem that had shaped one family's most private catastrophe. In the summer of 1962, Eunice Kennedy Shriver did something that would outlast every political achievement her family had ever accumulated. She opened a day camp in her backyard in Potomac, Maryland, Camp Shriver, it was called, and invited young people with intellectual disabilities to swim, to play sports, to compete, and to be treated for a few weeks in the summer as athletes rather than patients. The camp was modest in scale. A backyard, a swimming pool, a group of young people who had been told in 1,000 spoken and unspoken ways that they were not capable of the things other children could do. The idea behind it was not modest at all. Eunice believed, with the kind of conviction that does not bend to institutional resistance or social stigma, that people with intellectual disabilities were capable of far more than society assumed. She believed that physical activity and competition could build confidence, community, pride, and dignity in ways that institutional care, however well intentioned, never could. She believed this because she had grown up with a sister who had wanted nothing more than to participate in the world her family inhabited, and who had been denied that participation, not by her own limitations, but by a system that could not see past them. Camp Shriver was this seed. It grew year after year as Eunice expanded the program, recruited volunteers, built partnerships, and pushed the idea further than anyone in the disability community had pushed it before. 6 years later, on July 20th, 1968, at Soldier Field in Chicago, the first International Special Olympics Games were held. 1,000 athletes from 26 states and Canada competed in track and field events and swimming. The Chicago Park District provided the facilities. The Kennedy Foundation provided the funding, and Eunice Kennedy Shriver stood at the center of it all. Not as a Kennedy wife or a Kennedy sister playing a ceremonial role, but as the architect of a movement that she had imagined, built, and willed into existence. The opening ceremony that day included a declaration that would become the Special Olympics oath: "Let me win. But if I cannot win, let me be brave in the attempt." The words could have been written for the sister Eunice had watched try and fail and try again and be punished for the trying. It would be easy, and it would be wrong as to frame this as redemption. The channel guidelines for this story warn against neat morals, and the caution is warranted. What Eunice built did not undo what was done to Rosemary. No number of Special Olympic Games could give Rosemary back her voice, her mobility, her diary, her dances, her smile that lit up a room. The family that had failed Rosemary also helped transform the way America understood disability, and that transformation was real and consequential and has improved the lives of millions of people. But it did not repair the original wound. It meant that Rosemary's suffering became part of the engine that powered reforms for other families, other children, other women who might otherwise have been subjected to the same institutional indifference that had shaped Rosemary's early life and the same medical arrogance that had destroyed it. That is not a redemption story. It is something more complicated and more honest. A family that converted its worst private failure into one of its most meaningful public contributions without ever being able to make the failure itself right. The full truth about Rosemary's lobotomy did not become widely known until decades after it occurred. The family's wall of silence held for years, maintained by the same discipline that had always governed how the Kennedys presented themselves to the world. Journalists and biographers pieced together the story over time, working through fragments of medical records, institutional correspondence, and the occasional guarded comment from family associates. By the late 20th century, the basic facts, the surgery, the catastrophic outcome, the decades of concealment had entered the public record and could no longer be denied or deflected. Kate Clifford Larson's 2015 biography, Rosemary, The Hidden Kennedy Daughter, became the most comprehensive account of Rosemary's life, drawing on family archives, institutional records, and interviews to construct the story in its fullest documented form. The book gave Rosemary something the family had denied her for most of her life: a narrative of her own. Toll was the kind of intimacy and care that treated her as a person with interiority, desire, and worth, rather than as a problem that a powerful family had failed to solve. Joe Kennedy Sr. suffered a massive stroke in December of 1961 that left him largely unable to speak for the remaining 8 years of his life. The patriarch who had built the dynasty, who had controlled every variable, who had authorized the surgery that destroyed his daughter, spent his final years in a wheelchair, watching the family he had constructed continue without him, watching his sons be elected and assassinated, watching the name he had built become synonymous with both glory and grief, and carrying whatever he carried about Rosemary in a silence that was no longer chosen, but imposed. He died in November of 1969 at the age of 81. Whether the voicelessness of his final years felt like punishment or mercy, whether the man who had made the most consequential decision of his life spent those years trapped with the knowledge of what he had done, unable to articulate it or atone for it, is something no one outside his own mind could know. In the decades after the lobotomy's full truth became more widely known, the surviving Kennedy siblings gradually rebuilt a relationship with Rosemary. The visits to St. Coletta became more frequent. Eunice came, Ted came, Jean came. They brought Rosemary back to the family compound at Hyannis Port for holidays and gatherings. Carefully, with assistance, integrating her back into the family life from which she had been separated for so long. By the accounts of people who witnessed these later visits, Rosemary could recognize her siblings. She could respond to warmth and affection. She could not speak in full sentences, could not walk without help, could not inhabit the world the way she once had. But she was there. The family that had hidden her was, finally, in its later years, trying to bring her back, not to the life she might have had, which was gone forever, but to the family itself. Rose Kennedy outlived her husband by more than 2 decades, dying in January of 1995 at the age of 104. She had buried 4 of her 9 children: Joe Jr. in the war, Kick in the plane crash, Jack in Dallas, Bobby in Los Angeles, and had watched the family she built become both the most celebrated and the most devastated dynasty in American history. In her later years, Rose visited Rosemary at St. Coletta. The visits were quiet. The daughter she found there was not the daughter she had raised. Not the girl who had tried on dresses and recorded dances in her diary. Not the young woman who had curtsied at Buckingham Palace. But Rose came. Whatever the limits of her care had been in 1941, whatever she had known or not known about the lobotomy, she did not stop being Rosemary's mother. She endured that too, the way she endured everything, with discipline, with faith, and with a silence that kept its own counsel. Rosemary Kennedy died on January 7, 2005, at the age of 86. Siblings were at her side. She had spent more than 60 years at St. Coletta, longer than she had spent in the world outside it, longer than the combined public careers of her brothers who became president and senators and attorney general, longer than the entire Ark of Camelot from its construction to its collapse. She was buried beside her parents at Holyhood Cemetery in Brookline, Massachusetts, the same town where she had been born, where Rose had cut her meat at the dinner table, where the family had first begun the project that would carry them from Boston to London to Washington to the center of American mythology. The distance between Brookline and Jefferson, Wisconsin, was about 1,000 miles. The distance between the life Rosemary might have lived and the life she actually lived is immeasurable. St. Coletta continues to operate today, serving people with intellectual and developmental disabilities across communities in southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois, with a care network of more than 400 employees. The facility that housed Rosemary Kennedy for 6 decades is now part of an institutional legacy that has evolved far beyond what it was in the 1940s, shaped in part by the very reforms that the Kennedy family's advocacy helped set in motion. Special Olympics, the organization Eunice Kennedy Shriver founded in her backyard in 1962 and launched at Soldier Field in 1968, has grown into a global movement. It now serves roughly 5.5 to 6 million athletes, unified partners, coaches, and volunteers across more than 170 countries. Timothy Shriver, Eunice's son, serves as chairman, carrying the work his mother built from the wreckage of what was done to his aunt into a second generation, and a scope that Eunice, standing in her backyard in Potomac with a handful of young swimmers, could not have imagined. The organization remains one of the largest and most consequential disability inclusion movements in the world, and its origin story leads back through Eunice, through the Kennedy Foundation, through Camp Shriver and Soldier Field, to a room in a hospital in Washington in November of 1941, and to a young woman who was never asked what she wanted. The Kennedys became a symbol of vigor, beauty, competition, public service, and the particular American faith that a family can be built into something larger than itself. Those values produced presidents and senators and ambassadors and one of the most recognizable names in the history of the Republic. They also produced a family system that could not tolerate a daughter who needed slowness, patience, and a life not measured by performance. Rosemary Kennedy was not the victim of a single bad decision. She was the casualty of a family architecture that treated deviation as threat, that confused control with care, and that believed, because the era believed it, because the class believed it, because the patriarch believed it, that the right expert with the right procedure could solve a problem that was never a problem at all. The daughter who was presented at Buckingham Palace in May of 1938 spent most of her adult life in a residential facility in rural Wisconsin, cared for by nuns, visited eventually by the siblings who had grown up without her. That single contrast carries the weight of the entire story, and no reflection, however careful, can make it land more gently than it does.